Hey guys, tonight we're stepping straight into the darkest alleys of medieval Europe, where the air smells faintly of smoke, damp hay, and something you don't want to identify too closely. You're standing in a cramped street, torches flickering overhead, and whispers slithering from shuttered windows. News spreads faster than any horse could ride. People are dropping dead in terrifying numbers, and nobody knows why. It's the mid-1300s, the era of the Black Death, and honestly, you probably won't survive this. But don't worry, you get the fun of walking through it all from the comfort of your pillow. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle past a row of carts, each carrying shrouded shapes that used to be neighbors. The bells toll constantly, as if the church has given up distinguishing between hours and death notices. Rats dart along the walls, and you notice the way their fleas jump off, as if auditioning for a very grim circus act. It's here you realize the scope. In just a few years, the Black Death wipes out between a third and half of Europe's population. Imagine half your town gone. Shops empty, schools silent, every other house shuttered. Historians still argue whether it was truly bubonic plague alone, or a cocktail of diseases fanned by bad sanitation and medieval medicine that thought leeches were a cure-all. One chronicler swears he saw entire villages vanish overnight. Another describes priests refusing to give last rites because they couldn't keep up. And here's the quirky detail. Some people thought bathing too much would open the pores and invite the plague inside. So dirt became a sort of medieval hand sanitizer. Spoiler, it didn't work. You can almost hear someone mutter, "Better safe than scrubbed," while clutching a charm bag of dried herbs that smelled more like soup seasoning than protection. Picture yourself walking along London Bridge, not the cheerful nursery rhyme version, but a stretch crowded with makeshift burial barges. The Thames carries bodies downstream like some macabre delivery service. And yet, even amid despair, the human imagination kicks in. Street performers shout that they can chase away death with dancing, leading to the infamous Dance of Death art style that sweeps across Europe, grim skeletons pulling pop-and-lock moves beside kings and peasants alike. You watch the murals form, every brushstroke a reminder that no rank spares you. And oh, the jokes people made. Imagine villagers nervously laughing about how garlic bread might keep away more than just vampires. Humor becomes survival. If you don't laugh, you weep. You overhear a man say he survived because he only drank ale, never water. Probably the only time being perpetually tipsy was considered doctor's orders. Still, behind every jest, the numbers weigh heavy. Florence loses 60% of its population. Entire monasteries fall silent. Yet amid the grimness, something transformative brews. With so many workers gone, surviving peasants suddenly have bargaining power. Fields overgrow, castles beg for laborers, and the first faint whispers of social change stir. You, trudging through the silence, realize this plague doesn't just kill, it reshapes society. But not every corner of Europe reacts the same way. In some towns, people lash out, blaming minorities, foreigners, or anyone different, leading to pogroms and massacres almost as deadly as the disease itself. You see torchlight mobs storming houses, convinced that scapegoats poison wells. Historians still argue whether these frenzied accusations stem from panic or were a convenient excuse for old prejudices. Either way, fear amplifies the body count. Then there are the flagellants, bands of zealots marching barefoot, whipping themselves in bloody processions, convinced that public penance will persuade God to end the plague. You watch them stumble past, chanting in Latin, their backs raw. Neighbors watch too, torn between admiration and horror. Meanwhile, doctors in long bird-beak masks stride about with herbs stuffed in the noses, the medieval version of hazmat suits. To you, they look like cosplayers who got lost on their way to Comic-Con, but to them, it's life or death, and still the toll mounts. In just a few years, up to 75 million people vanish worldwide. Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa feel the plague's scythe as much as Europe. Trade routes become arteries of doom, each caravan and ship carrying invisible stowaways. You imagine a sailor sneezing once in Genoa, and weeks later, an entire region keeling over. Some tales exaggerate wildly. Travelers insist entire nations cease to exist. Were they exaggerating, or did the trauma blur truth and myth? Historians still argue whether population records can ever tell us the real number. But standing here, in the smoky glow of torchlight, you sense that the exact digits hardly matter. The experience, the silence, the fear, the reek of decay is what defined the era. And yet, amid the shadow, there's resilience. Survivors plant flowers over mass graves, as if nature could gently blanket the horror. Artists carve gravestones with hopeful doves. Musicians play soft tunes in squares, reminding the living that life continues. You walk away from the clamor of bells, past shuttered houses and skeletal doctors, into the countryside, where the air at last smells of grass instead of fear. The fields, though overgrown, promise regrowth. By now you realize the Black Death wasn't just about body counts. It was about how humans, fragile and inventive, stumble through catastrophe with a mix of terror, faith, humor, and sheer stubbornness. And as you keep walking, night falling soft around you, the road ahead carries you toward other medieval reckonings where the numbers are just as staggering, and sometimes even stranger. You hear the thunder before you see it, not from the sky, but from hooves. The ground trembles like a giant drumbeat, and a cloud of dust swallows the horizon. You clutch the reins of your imaginary horse and realize you're riding with the Mongols, a people who treated speed and fear as weapons sharper than any sword. Wherever these riders go, body counts rise to numbers that still make jaws drop centuries later. The leader at the front, Genghis Khan himself, cuts a figure both ordinary and legendary. You wouldn't recognize him in a crowd. Broad face, worn clothes, nothing like the jewel-draped kings of Europe. But that's the point. His genius isn't sparkle, it's strategy. Historians still argue whether his armies killed 30 million people across Asia and Europe, or whether chroniclers inflated the figures out of awe and terror. Either way, the scale of destruction is staggering. You trot into a conquered city, Zhongdu, today's Beijing, its wooden walls still smoking. Reports claim hundreds of thousands perished here, though the exact math gets murky. Medieval chroniclers loved big round numbers, so a guesstimate of 1 million dead could mean a lot of people we couldn't count. Still, you can almost hear the crack of siege engines, the screams as fire arrows light rooftops, and the sudden silence after the Mongols sweep through. The quirky tidbit here: the Mongols weaponized psychological warfare as much as arrows. They'd sometimes spare a single survivor from a massacre, sending him staggering into the next city to spread tales of horror. Imagine being that unlucky messenger. So, they built a pyramid out of our neighbors. Good luck. Fear alone could make entire fortresses surrender before the first arrow flew. You ride on, the steppe wind cutting at your face. The Mongols don't bother with cumbersome baggage trains. They live off the land, drinking mare's milk and sleeping under open skies. Compared to the plodding knights of Europe, they're like medieval special forces on turbo mode. And this mobility makes their kill counts terrifyingly efficient. One army could cover 100 miles in a day, storm a city, vanish, and reappear weeks later in another empire entirely. You think of it as history's most ruthless, surprise road trip. Still, numbers remain elusive. At Nishapur in 1221, after a Mongol commander was killed, sources say 1.7 million people were executed in retaliation. Historians today shake their heads. That number is almost certainly inflated. But even if the real figure was closer to 100,000, the trauma carved into memory ensured people retold it bigger and bloodier with every generation. As you lean on your saddle horn, you overhear Mongol generals debating tactics. They talk about feigned retreats, pretending to run away, luring enemies out, then circling back to slaughter them. One general chuckles, recalling how whole European armies fell for the trick again and again. It's the medieval equivalent of falling for the same prank call every weekend. But it wasn't all chaos. The Mongols also built an empire that knitted together China, Persia, and even parts of Eastern Europe, reopening trade routes that carried silk, spices, and, unfortunately, diseases like the plague you just walked through in Section 1. You see caravans rolling under Mongol protection, safe in a way they hadn't been for centuries. It's bizarre. The same riders who leveled cities also guaranteed safe passage for merchants. Destruction and creation rode side by side. One of the stranger details, Genghis Khan's army carried portable felt tents, or gurs, that could be packed up in an hour. While enemies struggled to maintain supply chains, the Mongols moved like nomadic ghosts. You picture an enemy scout reporting back, "Sir, they camped here last night, but by morning, poof," and his commander muttering, "That's not helpful, Greg." You cross into Eastern Europe now, following the Mongols into Hungary and Poland in the 1240s. At the Battle of Legnica, they smash a coalition of knights so thoroughly that the survivors flee west in panic. Chroniclers describe mountains of the slain, though the real count was probably in the tens of thousands. Still, for medieval Europe, that was apocalypse level. You notice how the writers calmly collect ears or noses from fallen enemies, using them as gruesome census tools. Suddenly, medieval bookkeeping seems a little too creative. Yet the Mongols weren't unstoppable. Weather stretched supply lines and internal rivalries slowed them down. You pause at the edge of Vienna, where locals whisper that if Genghis Khan hadn't died in 1227, the riders might have gone all the way to the Atlantic. Historians still argue whether Europe was saved by resilience or by sheer luck of timing. Standing here, it feels more like a coin toss between destiny and logistics. And about Genghis himself, did you know he outlawed the kidnapping of women, encouraged merit-based promotion, and introduced postal relays across his empire? It's easy to forget the lawgiver behind the conqueror, but his reforms stitched together the same world his armies drenched in blood. Talk about complicated legacies. The body counts of the Mongol conquest boggle the imagination. From Khwarezm to Kiev, from Baghdad, which we'll wander into next section, to the gates of Europe, entire populations either vanished or lived in permanent fear. You sense the paradox, were the Mongols history's greatest destroyers or the unlikely architects of a globalized medieval world? Both might be true. As your horse slows and the dust settles, you glance back over endless plains. The echoes of hoofbeats fade, but the tallies they left behind still haunt history books. And somewhere in that silence, you realize the Mongols didn't just change maps. They reset humanity's scale of what devastation could mean. You drift now toward the Middle East, where the desert night feels cool and sharp against your skin. The year is 1258, and ahead of you lies Baghdad, the glittering jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, once called the City of Peace. By daylight it dazzles with gardens, libraries, and domes that gleam under the sun. But you arrive under a sky smeared with smoke. The Mongols have come, and the numbers you're about to witness will make even the horrors of the plague feel like a grim prelude. Picture yourself approaching the Great Walls. For centuries, Baghdad thrived as the beating heart of Islamic scholarship and trade, home to the House of Wisdom, where texts from Greece, India, and Persia were translated and debated. Now Mongol siege engines pound relentlessly, their rocks crashing into towers with sickening rhythm. Citizens huddle in cellars, whispering prayers. Some cling to the rumor that the city's river, the Tigris, will somehow protect them. Spoiler, it doesn't. When the gates finally collapse, the Mongols pour in. Chroniclers record body counts so staggering they barely seem real. One Persian historian swears 800,000 died. Another pushes the figure past 1,000,000. Historians still argue whether those numbers reflect reality or whether medieval writers simply reached for the largest number they could imagine. What's certain is that Baghdad's population is decimated, its scholars silenced, its streets running with chaos. You walk past stacks of corpses, their sheer number making individual faces blur into one haunting mass. The Mongols, methodical as ever, execute not just soldiers, but civilians. The Caliph himself, al-Mustasim, is reportedly rolled up in a carpet and trampled by horses so his blood won't taint the earth. Quirky detail, Mongols believed spilling royal blood on the ground offended the spirits, so they devised creative workarounds. Honestly, it sounds like the world's darkest loophole. And then there's the river. Imagine standing by the banks of the Tigris as scholars fling books into the water to keep them from the invaders. Some accounts say the river ran black with ink from destroyed manuscripts, then red with blood. You glance at the currents, wondering which shade is myth and which is memory. On either way, it's a haunting image, the world's greatest library drowned alongside its people. The Mongols, efficient as ever, repurpose survivors as slaves. Skilled artisans are dragged east to enrich Mongol cities, while Baghdad's once bustling bazaars fall eerily silent. A merchant who once sold saffron and silk now sits with empty hands, watching smoke coil into the sky. You feel the city's heartbeat fade, replaced by the steady drum of Mongol boots. What's striking is how final it feels. Baghdad never fully recovers as a center of global learning. Imagine Oxford or Paris wiped off the map overnight. What ideas, what inventions, what stories would vanish with them? That's what Baghdad's fall represents. Yet historians still argue whether the city's decline was truly permanent or whether later dynasties managed flickers of revival. Standing here in the rubble, it feels more like a candle snuffed out mid-sentence. And the quirky, almost absurd contrast. While the Mongols destroyed Baghdad, they also tolerated and even encouraged certain religions in their empire. A Christian scribe might find employment in their administration, even as his Muslim neighbor lay dead in the streets. The randomness makes your head spin, like rolling dice with human lives. You wander deeper into the ruins, the smell of burned grain and parchment thick in the air. The Mongols pile severed heads into pyramids outside the city, a grotesque skyline meant to warn anyone who dares resist. Somewhere nearby, a child hums a lullaby, the only survivor from a wiped-out household. It's the kind of sound that will echo in your ears long after you leave. And yet the aftermath reveals another paradox. With Baghdad gone, centers of knowledge shift. To Cairo, to Damascus, even to distant Samarkand. The Mongols themselves eventually sponsor scholarship, astronomy, and trade. So did their destruction of Baghdad snuff out human progress, or did it redirect it? Historians still argue, their debates like echoes of those lost voices drowned in the Tigris. As you step over broken tiles and charred beams, you realize body counts aren't just about numbers. They're about memory. For Baghdad, the number, whether 200,000 or a million, isn't the point. The memory of devastation, the way it scarred the Islamic world, is what endures. You picture a scholar, decades later, telling students, once there was a library where the river now runs black. And then silence. The Mongols move on, leaving Baghdad a husk. You weary and dust-covered move too, following the currents of history westward, toward a France locked in a century-long war where death counts rise not from one decisive blow, but from endless bleeding. The clatter of hooves fades behind you as the smoky ruins of Baghdad dissolve, and suddenly the damp chill of northern France presses in. You find yourself trudging across a muddy field, the kind where your boots sink with every step, and you half expect a peasant to yell at you for trampling his cabbages. But no one bothers, because this land, like so many others, has been abandoned. War has been here too long, gnawing at everything it touches. Welcome to the 100 Years' War, where body counts aren't the neat totals of a single massacre, but an exhausting, centuries-long accumulation of battles, famines, and plagues. You glance around and realize this isn't a single war so much as a series of unfortunate events with swords. From 1337 to 1453, England and France squabble over crowns, lands, and dynastic pride, dragging soldiers and civilians into their feud. Historians still argue whether the death toll reached 3 million or far fewer, but either way, the chaos leaves France looking like someone set fire to a chessboard and then stomped on the ashes. You wander past a village near Crécy in 1346. The fields are churned by battle, and the English longbowmen still linger in stories here. With their 6-foot bows, they fire arrows faster than French knights can lower their lances. Chroniclers brag of thousands of knights mowed down like wheat. Though quirky detail, some French nobles were so weighed down by armor that when their horses collapsed, they thrashed helplessly on the ground like overturned turtles. Not exactly the glorious death song they'd imagined. And yet the civilians take the hardest blows. You step into a barn where straw lies scattered, the harvest rotting. Armies, too broke to pay their men, let them forage, a fancy way of saying pillage. Villagers hide their last chickens under floorboards, but soldiers sniff them out anyway. Imagine surviving the plague only to have a band of sweaty mercenaries eat your dinner and burn your house. Medieval life. 0 stars on Yelp. What deepens the misery is famine. Crops fail from trampling, taxes skyrocket to pay for endless campaigns, and starving peasants flee to towns that are already overrun with disease. Remember those plague bells from Section 1? They ring here too, mingling with the clash of swords. The Hundred Years' War isn't just one long body count. It's a blender where hunger, pestilence, and violence mix until nobody remembers which killed more. Still, the battles are spectacular in their own right. Agincourt, 1415. You slog through a narrow field drenched in autumn rain. English archers dig sharpened stakes into the mud, turning the ground into a porcupine's nightmare. The French knights charge anyway, sinking knee-deep. It's like watching expensive sports cars drive straight into quicksand. Chroniclers tally tens of thousands of French dead, though historians still argue whether those figures were patriotic exaggeration or accurate bookkeeping. Either way, the scene is carnage, dressed in mud and steel. But not all the war's famous moments involve arrows and armor. You slip into Orléans in 1429, where a teenage girl named Joan of Arc insists God has told her to lift the siege. Skeptics roll their eyes. Some soldiers even joke about her haircut. Yet against all odds, she leads an assault that turns the tide. Death counts here blur with miracle stories, and historians debate whether her presence truly saved the city or whether timing and morale mattered more. Quirky tidbit. After the victory, soldiers celebrated by eating so much roast beef that chroniclers noted it almost as carefully as the number of slain enemies. Priorities, right? Still, the war drags on. Whole generations are born and buried without knowing peace. Children grow up thinking flaming villages and wandering mercenaries are just part of normal weather. You walk into Rouen after a siege and see skeletal citizens gnawing on weeds, their bodies thin, but their eyes still stubborn. The body count here doesn't come from sword thrusts. It's starvation quietly finishing the work. And then there's the politics. Kings raise taxes, nobles switch sides, mercenaries freelance like medieval gig workers with swords. At one point, the war pauses because both countries are too broke to keep fighting. You half expect someone to invent a Kickstarter campaign, help fund our next invasion. Stretch goals include new crossbows. By the end, in 1453, France finally pushes England out of nearly all continental holdings. The war leaves fields abandoned, cities scarred, and entire populations reduced. Was the toll millions? Hundreds of thousands? Historians still argue, because medieval record-keeping was basically, lots of people died, it was bad. Yet as you stand on a hill overlooking smoldering villages, the precise digits feel less important than the weary silence blanketing the land. And here's the kicker. Despite the unimaginable losses, the war reshapes Europe in surprising ways. France emerges more unified, England begins to rethink its monarchy, and the age of knights fades as gunpowder weapons rise. Out of carnage comes modernity, though no one living through it would have thanked history for the upgrade. You turn from the muddy fields, shoulders heavy with the weight of a century's worth of casualties. Ahead in the distance, desert winds stir. Another conqueror waits, Timur the Lame, who doesn't just kill but builds pyramids of skulls as trophies. Compared to him, the 100 Years' War feels almost restrained. Almost. The air dries as you leave France behind, and your boots crunch now on sand instead of mud. The horizon flickers with heat, and in the distance rises a city of domes and walls. But don't get too attached. It won't stand long. Timur the Lame, or Tamerlane as the West later nicknames him, is on the march, and his idea of leaving a calling card is stacking skulls into pyramids so tall you can spot them from half a mile away. You watch him ride in. One leg stiff, his gait uneven, but his gaze sharp enough to cut through steel. Timur, born in 1336, builds an empire across Central Asia and into Persia, India, and even the fringes of the Ottoman world. His campaigns kill so many that medieval chroniclers practically run out of metaphors. Historians still argue whether the true body count reaches 17 million or whether that's exaggeration layered with fear. Either way, the pyramids of skulls tell their own story, one you can't mistake for poetic license. Take Isfahan, 1387. The city resists Timur, and he retaliates with merciless efficiency. Chroniclers claim 70,000 people die, their heads collected to build towering mounds. You step into the plaza, the sun glaring down on white bone, the stench clinging even weeks later. Quirky detail. Some soldiers arrange the skulls neatly, like macabre Lego bricks, while others just pile them haphazardly. You picture arguments breaking out. No, no, symmetry matters, Steve. But Timur isn't just brutality. He also sponsors art and architecture, turning Samarkand into a glittering capital. Imagine walking its blue-tiled streets, minarets glistening in the sun, even as caravans bring stories of distant massacres. The contradiction is dizzying. How can the same man commission delicate mosaics while ordering tens of thousands to the sword? Historians still argue whether he genuinely cared about culture or just wanted monuments to match his ego. You ride with his armies toward Delhi in 1398. The city trembles as Timur approaches, and the Sultan's forces rush to defend it. The battle is fierce but brief. The Mongol-style cavalry overwhelms defenders. Timur, worried about being outnumbered, preemptively executes thousands of captives before the fight even begins. By the time he's finished, perhaps 100,000 civilians lie dead. You wander the streets after the sack. Palaces gutted, markets silent, dogs nosing through rubble. Yet in Samarkand, artisans from Delhi are carried home alive, pressed into decorating Timur's dream city. Death and beauty travel hand in hand. Then there's Baghdad, 1401. Yes, the same Baghdad you saw gutted by Mongols in Section 3 gets another round of devastation. Timur's men slaughter tens of thousands, and once again, skull pyramids rise along the walls. You pause at one of them, wind whistling through hollow sockets. A survivor mutters that the city is cursed, doomed to be destroyed by conquerors again and again. You can't help but wonder if he's right. One quirky tidbit: Timur believed astrology shaped his destiny. He timed campaigns according to the stars, consulting astrologers before major battles. Imagine thousands of lives hanging on whether Jupiter happened to be in retrograde. His soldiers must have dreaded cloudy nights. Sorry guys, can't invade today. Mercury's in a weird mood. And yet, for all his cruelty, Timur's empire doesn't last long after his death in 1405. He dies on campaign, planning to invade China, and his successors can't hold together the sprawling lands he conquered. The pyramids of skulls crumble back into dust, the bones forgotten by locals who just want to rebuild. Historians still argue whether Timur should be remembered as a world-class strategist or just history's most violent vandal. Walking past the ruins, you feel both truths pressing down at once. But there's something chilling about the way memory holds him. Even centuries later, Central Asian folktales warn children about Timur's wrath. His tomb in Samarkand carries an inscription that supposedly curses anyone who disturbs it, an inscription ignored in 1941 when Soviet archaeologists opened it. Quirky coincidence? The very next day, Nazi Germany invaded the USSR. Suddenly, the curse didn't feel so laughable. As you turn from the desert winds, the sound of minarets fades into the distant clang of swords on shields. Ahead lies Iberia, where the Reconquista drags on for centuries, its body counts stretched across generations. Unlike Timur's brutal bursts, the deaths here seep slowly, as battles, forced marches, and expulsions reshape a peninsula. The desert heat softens into the dry hills of Iberia, where olive groves stretch across ridges and castle towers prick the sky. You wander into a land where war isn't a single campaign but a long, grinding rhythm, centuries of advance and retreat. This is the Reconquista, the effort by Christian kingdoms to reclaim the peninsula from Muslim rule. And while it doesn't give you one neat massacre number like Timur's skull pyramids, the body counts here accumulate like layers of dust on a forgotten shelf. It begins back in the 700s when Muslim forces crossed from North Africa and established Al-Andalus, dazzling Europe with cities like Córdoba and Granada. By the medieval peak, Córdoba shines with streetlights, public baths, and libraries that would make Paris jealous. You stroll through a bustling market, spices, silks, and scholars debating Aristotle in 3 languages. But look closer. Beyond the wealth lies tension, and every century or so the political winds shift, sparking new battles. Historians still argue whether the Reconquista should be seen as one long war or a messy patchwork of skirmishes, treaties, and occasional neighborly betrayals. By the 11th century, Christian kingdoms pushed southward, their knights clanking in mail. You pass a battlefield at Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, where Christian forces defeat the Almohads. Chroniclers boast that 100,000 Muslims fell that day, though modern scholars suggest the figure was far smaller, maybe tens of thousands. Still, standing here, the clang of swords and cries of war echo loud enough that the exact number hardly matters. Quirky tidbit: knights on both sides sometimes pause the carnage to trade or ransom prisoners. One Christian chronicler even admits he picked up a taste for spiced couscous while camping opposite Muslim troops. War may kill, but dinner still matters. The Reconquista isn't only about battles, it's also about population shifts. As Christian kingdoms advance, Muslim and Jewish communities face pressure to flee, convert, or accept second-class status. Imagine trudging on a forced march through dusty hills, belongings piled on a mule, while soldiers jeer from behind. Each step is a body count of another kind, not from swords, but from exile and starvation. Historians still argue how many truly perished in these slow-motion displacements, but the human toll is undeniable. You step into Granada in the late 1400s, the last Muslim stronghold. Its Alhambra palace glitters with mosaics and fountains, beauty clinging even as cannons roar outside the walls. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella finally take the city, ending centuries of Muslim rule. The terms of surrender promise tolerance, but within years the Inquisition begins pressing conversions and expelling Jews and Muslims who resist. Body counts here don't pile in heaps on a battlefield. They stretch across roads and harbors as families scatter to North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, or die at sea. One quirky belief takes hold during these years. Some Spanish Christians swear that wearing a scallop shell on a pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela will shield them from Muslim blades. You picture a knight charging into battle with a seashell pinned to his armor, like the medieval version of a Lucky Charm bracelet. Spoiler, it worked about as well as crocodile dung sunscreen. The Reconquista also shifts Europe's imagination. Victories fuel a crusading spirit that doesn't stop at Iberia's borders. The same monarchs who claimed Granada fund Columbus that same year, sending ships west to new lands. In a way, the body counts of Iberia spill into the Atlantic, reshaping the world. And yet, when you pause to listen to locals centuries later, the story isn't only about war. Songs in villages recall lost loves between Christian and Muslim neighbors. Folk tales speak of Moorish princesses wandering hills, and architecture blends Islamic arches with Christian spires. Death tolls dominate chronicles, but the lived experience leaves a more tangled memory. Historians still argue whether Iberia was a battlefield of hatred or a crossroads of coexistence shattered too soon. You wander through a narrow alley in Toledo, once called the City of Three Cultures, or in Kinning, where synagogues, mosques, and churches stood side by side. Now many are abandoned or repurposed, echoes of a pluralism drowned by war. The silence here feels heavier than any battlefield roar. As you step out of Iberia, the air thickens with sea salt. Ahead, cannons rumble over water, and a city of massive walls braces for the end of its thousand-year reign. The fall of Constantinople waits, and with it another staggering tally of lives lost and legends born. The salt wind sharpens as you approach the Bosporus, and ahead, Constantinople rises like a dream. Mighty walls glimmering in the dawn, domes catching the sun, the Hagia Sophia soaring above it all. For 1,000 years, this city has stood as the bulwark between East and West, its triple walls shrugging off countless sieges. But now in 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmet II, just 21 years old, has rolled up with something Europe hasn't faced before. Gunpowder artillery big enough to make the ground quake. And you standing here are about to watch one of history's most famous falls unfold, where the body counts are whispered in awe and fear. You trace your fingers along the Theodosian walls, 20 feet thick, studded with towers. For centuries, enemies have battered these stones with no luck. But Mehmet has hired Hungarian cannon makers, and their bronze monsters fire stone balls the size of small cars. Each shot thunders like an earthquake, shaking dust loose from the ramparts. You picture defenders plugging cracks with earth and timber, scrambling like desperate DIY homeowners trying to patch a roof during a hurricane. Inside, Emperor Constantine the Round rallies the city's few thousand defenders, Byzantine soldiers, Venetian and Genoese allies, even civilians pressed into service. Against them, Over 80,000 Ottomans, archers, cavalry, janissaries, and those terrifying cannons. Historians still argue whether the defenders numbered 7,000 or closer to 10,000, but either way, they're ridiculously outmatched. The quirky detail? Each night, while the defenders repair the walls, Mehmet's men chant prayers so loudly that the city can hear them. Imagine trying to sleep while an entire army basically performs the medieval equivalent of blasting a hype playlist through giant speakers. Not exactly restful. You wander through the streets, priests carry icons, processions wind past half-empty houses, and children peek from doorways. Everyone knows the stakes. If Constantinople falls, the last remnant of the Roman Empire vanishes. Rumors spread that angels will descend to save the city, while others whisper that a marble emperor sleeps beneath Hagia Sophia, waiting to rise in its darkest hour. Historians still argue whether Constantine IX's final stand was fact or legend. Did he really strip off his imperial regalia and fight in the front lines, disappearing into the melee? Either way, his fate mirrors the city's, and then the breach comes. May 29th, 1453. Mehmet unleashes a final assault. After weeks of pounding, the walls gape open. You squeeze into the chaos as janissaries pour through, their war cries blending with cannon smoke and the screams of defenders. The emperor falls or vanishes. The Ottomans swarm the city. For 3 days, looting and slaughter consume Constantinople. Chroniclers claim tens of thousands die, though exact figures blur. Historians still argue whether it was 30,000 or closer to 60,000. You stand in Hagia Sophia as the doors splinter. Refugees huddle inside, clutching icons. Legends say the moment the Ottomans stormed in, a priest carrying the Eucharist vanished into the wall, destined to emerge when the church becomes Christian again. Quirky, mystical details like that cling to the fall, softening the horror with a layer of myth. But the reality is grim. Survivors are enslaved, treasures carted away, and the great church becomes a mosque. Yet Mehmet doesn't just destroy, he rebuilds. He repopulates the city, restores markets, and declares Constantinople the capital of his empire, now Istanbul. Out of the ashes, a new world center rises. You walk its streets weeks later and hear not only Turkish, but Greek, Armenian, Arabic, Italian. It feels less like an ending and more like a shift in history's tectonic plates. And here's the strange twist. While Europe mourns Constantinople, it also panics. With land routes eastward now firmly under Ottoman control, explorers look to the sea. You can almost hear Columbus whispering, "Well, guess we'll try sailing west." In that sense, the city's fall indirectly nudges Europe into the age of exploration, another cascade of body counts waiting across oceans. As the smoke clears, you linger by the shattered walls. The silence presses in, broken only by gulls wheeling overhead. You realize this wasn't just a city falling, it was an empire, a 1,000-year link to Rome, collapsing in a single roar of cannon fire. The numbers may never be exact, but the weight of what ended here still lingers. And as you turn away, the air sharpens with the scent of dust and marching boots. Across seas and deserts, other holy wars wait. Wars where men march under crosses, claiming divine mandate, and leave behind body counts written in both blood and legend. You leave the shattered stones of Constantinople behind, the scent of cannon smoke still in your lungs, and step into a different kind of holy fury. The ground beneath your feet is dusty. The banners overhead bear painted crosses, and voices chant hymns that sound half like prayers, half like war songs. You've joined the Crusades, those centuries-long expeditions where religion, politics, and greed mingle into one unstoppable march of bodies and body counts. The year feels fluid here. Sometimes it's 1099, with the First Crusade blazing across the Levant. Sometimes it's the 1200s, with later waves of crusaders tramping east. What remains constant is the sight of armed pilgrims swarming cities, convinced they fight for God. Historians still argue whether crusaders believed more in salvation or plunder, but the results are written in the tallies of the dead. Take Jerusalem, July 1099. You walk with the crusaders as they storm the walls after weeks of siege. Chroniclers gloat that when the city falls, they slaughter every Muslim and Jew inside, rivers of blood supposedly knee-deep. Now modern historians shake their heads. Knees of blood would require gallons on gallons, so maybe that's medieval exaggeration, but there's no denying thousands perished. Quirky tidbit, one chronicler cheerfully describes crusaders riding their horses through pools of gore up to the bridles, which sounds more like a heavy metal album cover than reliable math. You slip into a side street where families hide, clutching children, hoping mercy exists. But the crusaders, fired by both zeal and hunger, show little restraint. To them, the body count is not tragedy, it's divine justice. You feel the chill of that mindset, a conviction that makes death feel holy. And it isn't just Jerusalem. You march to Antioch, where crusaders endure months of famine so severe they gnaw on leather straps, and according to fringe rumors, even eat the bodies of fallen enemies. When the city finally falls, another massacre follows. Imagine surviving near starvation only to immediately unleash slaughter. Historians still argue whether the cannibalism tales are propaganda or grim truth, but either way, Antioch's streets ran red. Later crusades repeat the cycle. At Constantinople, yes, again, the Fourth Crusade in 1204 doesn't even bother reaching the Holy Land. Instead, the Crusaders sack the Christian city itself, looting relics, burning churches, and killing thousands of their fellow believers. You walk through Hagia Sophia, now desecrated twice in less than 250 years. Quirky contrast. One crusader steals a golden chalice and mails it home as a souvenir, while another uses the altar as a gambling table. So much for holy war. What makes the body counts here slippery is the mixture of combat and famine. Crusader armies often starve more than they fight. At Damietta in Egypt, a failed expedition leaves corpses lining the Nile as disease and hunger pick off more than enemy swords ever do. You can almost hear a soldier muttering, "I came for paradise, but all I got was dysentery." Medieval warfare, the original Oregon Trail. And yet, despite the carnage, the Crusades forge strange connections. You wander through a market in Acre before its fall, where Italian merchants haggle beside Arab traders, spices mingle with Latin hymns, and European knights learn words like sugar and sherbet. The exchanges outlast the wars themselves. Historians still argue whether the Crusades were more about destruction or cultural transmission, but standing here, it's clearly both. One quirky superstition flourishes during these wars. Crusaders believe wearing a cloth cross sewn to their tunics grants spiritual armor. You see men charging into battle with nothing but thread standing between them and an arrow. Needless to say, many quickly discover embroidery isn't bulletproof. Well, arrow-proof. And then there are the endless body counts of the sieges. At Acre in 1291, the final Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land, defenders and civilians cram into ships as the Mamluks storm the walls. Tens of thousands perish, the city razed. For Europe, it feels like the end of an era. For the locals, it's another brutal invasion in a long line of them. You stand on the pier, the smell of burning pitch heavy in the air, and hear the waves swallowing corpses. The Crusades leave behind a trail of numbers impossible to pin down. Was it hundreds of thousands? Millions over 2 centuries? Historians still argue because medieval chroniclers exaggerated victories, minimized defeats, and measured human lives in religious points scored. What's undeniable is the scale of devastation and the way faith, once thought to heal, becomes another engine of death. You step back from the din of chanting armies and smoldering cities. Ahead lies a different battlefield, one greener, muddier, and just as bloody. The banners shift from crosses to eagles, and you hear the thunder of knights colliding in one of medieval Europe's most iconic showdowns, the Battle of Grunwald. The dust of the Levant fades, and now the ground under your boots squishes with damp grass. Clouds hang heavy over wide fields, and in the distance you see 2 armies stretching farther than the horizon. Tens of thousands of men, banners flapping, spears bristling like forests. You've arrived in 1410 at the Battle of Grunwald, also called Tannenberg, one of the largest and bloodiest battles of medieval Europe. This is no distant holy war in the Middle East. It's Christian against Christian, knights versus knights, and the body count here will rival anything you've seen. On one side, the Teutonic Order, a military monastic brotherhood, polished in white cloaks with black crosses. They've dominated the Baltic for generations, crusading against pagan Lithuanians and expanding their influence like a corporation with swords. On the other, the allied forces of the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, led by King Władysław Jagiełło and Grand Duke Vytautas. Historians still argue whether this was a nationalist clash, a dynastic feud, or simply a power grab dressed in holy rhetoric. But one thing's certain, nearly every knight in Northern Europe seems to have shown up. Picture it, around 60,000 soldiers total, steel clashing, banners embroidered with saints, and war horses stamping nervously. You stand near the Polish camp, where priests bless troops with holy water, the air buzzing with prayers. Then horns blast, and the Lithuanians launch their charge, arrows whistling, cavalry thundering. Here comes the quirky bit. Early in the fight, the Lithuanians famously pretend to retreat, luring the Teutonic Knights into breaking formation. It's the medieval version of a fake-out in basketball, except instead of a crossover dribble, it's thousands of horsemen vanishing into the woods. Historians still argue whether this maneuver was a stroke of tactical genius or simply panic that turned lucky, but either way, it changes the course of the battle. The Teutonic Knights, thinking they've won, chase the Lithuanians too far and too fast. When they stumble back, sweaty and disorganized, the Poles hammer them. You hear steel groan, men scream, horses collapse under their riders. The sun glares down, and the field becomes a swamp of mud, blood, and shattered armor. Chroniclers later estimate over 8,000 Teutonic dead, plus thousands more captured or wounded. For the medieval world, those numbers are staggering. Whole generations of noble families cut down in a single day. And yet, even amid slaughter, the battle brims with strange little moments. One account claims the Polish king delayed entering the fight by kneeling for an extra-long prayer, frustrating his knights but perhaps calming their nerves. Another quirky tidbit, some soldiers carried banners painted not with saints but with personal mascots, like stags or dragons, turning the battlefield into a medieval parade of flags. Imagine fighting for your life while distracted by your opponent's goofy deer logo. The aftermath is devastating for the Teutonic Order. Their power shatters, and though they limp on for another century, their aura of invincibility is gone. You walk through their camp after the battle, where looted tents lie in heaps, and prisoners kneel under guard. Some are ransomed, others executed. A chronicler swears the pile of captured Teutonic banners stacked before the Polish king looked like a mountain of laundry. Death counts aside, the humiliation stings. But here's the scholarly wrinkle. Historians still argue over the exact body count. Some claim 30,000 died, others lower it, suggesting maybe half that. Medieval chroniclers love dramatic inflation. After all, we defeated 50,000 sounds way cooler than we scraped by against 10,000. Regardless of numbers, the battlefield itself confirms the horror. Bones unearthed centuries later still show sword cuts and arrowheads lodged in ribs. The human toll isn't just soldiers. Villages along the campaign trail are torched, peasants flee into forests, and famine follows in the wake of armies eating everything edible. You walk past abandoned farms, fields gone to weeds, and you realize the real body count often hides in hunger and disease after the clash. And still, legends soften the edges. Polish folklore insists angels hovered above their banners, ensuring victory. Teutonic tales mutter that betrayal doomed them, not poor tactics. Quirky conspiracy theories even pop up. One chronicler accuses a Hungarian ally of deliberately arriving late to watch the fun instead of helping. Medieval battles weren't just bloody. They were also prime material for medieval gossip columns. As you leave the field, your boots stick in the mud, each step a reminder of the thousands buried beneath. The battle shifts the balance of power in Eastern Europe, but it doesn't bring peace. Wars keep flaring, alliances keep breaking, and more fields keep filling with the dead. You glance east now, where the steppe stretches flat and endless, winds whipping grass in waves. Out there waits a different storm. Armies so vast their body counts turn chroniclers speechless. The Mongols are coming, and compared to them, even Grunwald will feel like a warm-up. The damp fields of Grunwald give way to an ocean of grass so wide it feels like you're standing at the edge of the world. The Eurasian steppe stretches flat in every direction, horizon shimmering like a mirage. And then you hear it, A low, distant rumble, at first like thunder, then like 1,000 drums. Hooves. The Mongols are riding, and the ground itself trembles under their charge. If you thought earlier body counts were wild, brace yourself. These horsemen are about to redefine mass death on a continental scale. You squint into the wind. Out of the haze appear riders in leather armor, bows slung across their backs, ponies small but tireless. Each Mongol carries multiple horses, switching mounts like you'd swap sneakers on a marathon. They shoot arrows while galloping, their aim terrifyingly accurate. Historians still argue whether Mongol arrows could pierce European plate armor, but most agree that even when they didn't, the sheer volume of arrows made defense impossible. Imagine standing in a storm where the raindrops are razor sharp. The numbers pile up quickly. In 1221, Genghis Khan's forces sack Nishapur in Persia. Chroniclers claim 7 million people are killed. An impossible figure, likely inflated, since the city probably held fewer than 100,000. Still, the point remains. Entire populations were wiped out. The quirky twist? Supposedly, the massacre was ordered by Genghis's son-in-law in revenge for his wife's death, turning one man's grief into an apocalypse. You travel westward, and by 1241, the Mongols slam into Europe. At the Battle of Legnica in Poland, knights gather to stop them, banners shining, armor gleaming. But the Mongols deploy smoke bombs, drums, and feigned retreats, psychological warfare centuries ahead of its time. One chronicle says Polish soldiers panicked, thinking demons had descended. Within hours, the army is crushed, the fields littered with corpses. Historians still argue whether 25,000 Europeans died that day or far fewer. But the legend of invincible horsemen spreads like wildfire. Another quirky tidbit: Mongols sometimes spared craftsmen and scribes, hauling them back east to enrich their empire. One bewildered Polish blacksmith, dragged to the steppe, ended up teaching metallurgy to his captors, while neighbors lay dead. The Mongols could be merciless or pragmatic, depending on the day. The death toll continues at Mohi in Hungary, where another European coalition faces annihilation. Bridges collapse under fleeing soldiers, drowning thousands in the river. Imagine trying to escape while your armored horse sinks like an anchor beneath you. Chroniclers claim tens of thousands die. Modern scholars suggest the number is smaller, but still catastrophic. Yet the Mongols weren't just about killing. They built an empire that stretched from Korea to the Black Sea, fostering trade along the Silk Road. You wander into Samarkand, once devastated, now buzzing with merchants again, camels plodding in with silks and spices. The paradox is dizzying. Body counts soar, yet stability follows. Historians still argue whether the Mongol Pax was worth the rivers of blood that paved it. And the legends? Endless. One tale insists the Mongols drank enemy blood to survive thirst on the march. Another swears they carried portable felt yurts, folding homes like IKEA kits. Quirky detail: some riders tied themselves to their saddles to nap while galloping, the medieval version of sleep driving. Efficient, terrifying, and deeply unsettling. The scariest part isn't even the battles, it's the sieges. At Baghdad in 1258, the Mongols topple the Abbasid Caliphate. Chroniclers say 200,000 to 1,000,000 die, libraries burn, and the Tigris runs black with ink from drowned manuscripts. Was it really that many? Historians still argue, but the destruction of knowledge feels as heavy as the destruction of bodies. You stand by the river, watching books bleed words into the water like dying fish. And just when Europe braces for more, the Mongols mysteriously withdraw after 1242, Genghis's heirs squabbling over succession. It's one of those moments where history pivots on luck. Had they stayed, Paris or Rome might have shared Baghdad's fate. Some villagers whispered divine intervention, others pointed to the death of the great Khan. Either way, the body count paused, not ended. You sit in the grass, wine tugging at your cloak, and realize the Mongol storm was more than battle. It was demographic earthquake. Whole cities erased, landscapes depopulated, cultures uprooted, and yet caravans later crisscrossed the empire, spreading paper, gunpowder, and noodles westward. The paradox leaves you dizzy. Killers and connectors, destroyers and bridge builders. As you rise, the steppe fades into a smoky campfire glow. Beyond, you hear chanting, not in Mongolian, but in a Slavic tongue. Warriors drink from wooden cups, shields stacked, swords glinting. Another showdown brews in Eastern Europe, one with fewer horses but just as many corpses. The Battle of Kulikovo waits in the dawn. The endless Mongol grasslands dissolve into a misty riverbank, the ground soft with dew. You hear frogs croaking, the faint lap of water, and then the heavy stomp of boots on sodden earth. It's 1380, and you stand on the banks of the Don River at Kulikovo, where Russians gather to face their Mongol overlords in a clash that will echo for centuries. This isn't just another battle. It's framed as the first spark of Russian independence, a turning point where body counts become the price of national myth. The dawn feels tense. On one side, Prince Dmitry of Moscow, later remembered as Dmitry Donskoy, rallies his coalition of Russian principalities. His banners shimmer with Orthodox icons, and priests chant blessings over the men. You see soldiers kissing crosses, clutching charms, their nerves steadied by ritual. On the other side, the Mongol Tatar army under Mamai, hardened by decades of tribute collecting and raiding. Historians still argue whether Mamai commanded as many troops as Russian sources claim. Some say 100,000 Tatars, others suggest half that. But either way, the field will soon choke with bodies. The quirky rumor of the day? A wandering monk named Sergius supposedly sends two warrior monks into battle, Peresvet and Osliabya. They fight not with prayers but with swords leading from the front. One tale insists Peresvet charges a Mongol champion, both men skewering each other in a single lance thrust, then collapsing dead together. It's the kind of duel that feels cinematic, like something out of a medieval blockbuster. The battle begins with dust clouds and arrows. Mongol horsemen swarm, but the Russians, for once, hold firm. Dmitry disguises himself, hiding his royal armor, while a body double rides in his place. Quirky but clever, it keeps morale steady if the prince falls, though imagine being the guy stuck as decoy royalty. Historians still argue whether this trick worked perfectly or whether chaos nearly cost them the day. Hours drag on. The field becomes a swamp of sweat, mud, and blood. Horses stumble, men hack blindly through fog and noise. You step carefully among fallen pikes, hearing the gasps of wounded who won't last the hour. Chroniclers estimate tens of thousands die here. 30,000 Tatars, 20,000 Russians, though modern scholars doubt the precision. Numbers blur when whole units vanish into rivers or forests. The turning point comes when Dmitry's hidden reserves charge. Fresh troops slam into exhausted Tatars, collapsing their lines. The rout is brutal. Mongol survivors scatter, hunted down as they flee. You smell the smoke of abandoned camps burning. Hear the moans of prisoners dragged away. Victory belongs to Moscow, but the ground is carpeted with its cost. And here's the quirky after effect. Russian folklore later romanticizes the battle as a holy triumph. Songs, epics, and paintings depict Kulikovo as the dawn of liberation, even though Mongol power lingers for another century. Historians still argue whether Kulikovo truly weakened Mongol dominance or was more symbolic than strategic. But standing on this soggy plain, with ravens already circling overhead, the symbolism feels carved in blood. You walk through the aftermath, where villagers dig shallow graves. Mothers search the heaps of bodies for sons, stripping helmets and wiping mud from lifeless faces. Survivors whisper prayers for both fallen Russians and Tatars, because when the dust clears, grief looks the same in any camp. Strange customs sprout from the carnage. Some say the soil of Kulikovo turned fertile with blood, harvests richer for years. Others whisper that the ghosts of the dead still ride at dawn, spectral horsemen galloping silently across the mist. Quirky, yes, but believable when you stand here, as the fog curls like pale banners across the ground. For Moscow, the battle becomes a cornerstone of identity. Monks write chronicles hailing Dmitry as a divinely chosen ruler. Villages retell the story until it blurs fact and legend. Kulikovo turns from one more medieval massacre into a mythic step toward a future Russia. But for the men who fell, it was just another field of mud, blood, and silence. You turn your gaze west, where another river waits, the Thames. The smell of plague lingers. The toll of church bells rings out, and across England a different body count mounts. Not from swords this time, but from revolt and rebellion, when peasants rise against their lords in fury. The peasants' revolt is waiting, and its tally won't be measured in battlefield corpses alone. The damp mist of Kulikovo drifts away, and you find yourself walking along narrow English lanes, hedgerows buzzing with summer insects, cottages leaning crookedly into the road. At first glance, it feels peaceful, but listen closer. Church bells toll, angry voices rise, and the scent of smoke curls on the wind. It's 1381, and the peasants' revolt is about to ignite. Unlike the grand armies of crusaders or Mongol horsemen, this uprising swells from the ground up. Farmers, laborers, townsfolk. Their weapons are pitchforks and cudgels. Their armor little more than boiled leather or whatever pots they could strap on. The body count here won't rival Timur or Genghis, but its chaos rattles England to its bones. The spark, taxes, specifically the hated poll tax. Every adult, rich or poor, charged the same. Imagine coughing up the same fee as your landlord while your roof leaks and your kids gnaw stale bread. Resentment bubbles over, and soon villages are rising. You walk with one such crowd as they march toward London, banners fluttering, voices chanting. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? Quirky slogan for sure, basically saying, God didn't create lords, so why should we serve them? Leading them is Wat Tyler, a name that echoes like a folk hero. By his side, the radical priest John Ball preaches equality, calling out corruption in rhymes and riddles. Historians still argue whether Ball was truly a revolutionary or just a loud-mouthed dreamer swept along. But his words fire the crowds. You hear peasants mutter, things will never be the same. The march swells into tens of thousands. Picture it. Men in ragged tunics, women carrying baskets of bread, kids scampering in excitement. When they reach London, the gates swing open. Sympathetic townsfolk let them in. Suddenly, the city is a carnival of revolt. Manor houses burn, tax records vanish in smoke, officials are dragged into the streets. One quirky tidbit, rebels supposedly hunted down lawyers first, torching legal documents with particular glee. Kill all the lawyers wasn't just a Shakespeare line, it was lived reality here. The body count starts small, scattered officials executed, a few violent clashes, but soon it grows. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, dragged from the Tower, is beheaded by the mob. Chroniclers claim it took several clumsy hacks to finish the job, the executioner not exactly a professional. You shudder at the thought, the crowd roaring approval as his head is paraded on a pike. And then comes the fateful meeting at Smithfield. Young King Richard II, only 14, rides out to parley with Wat Tyler. You stand among the crowd as tension crackles in the air. Words fly, tempers flare, and suddenly Tyler is struck down. Stabbed, some say, by the Lord Mayor of London. Historians still argue whether it was self-defense, treachery, or pure accident. But in a heartbeat, the rebel leader lies dying. The mob surges, ready to erupt. But Richard rides forward shouting, I am your captain now. Quirky, bold move for a teenager. Talk about a medieval mic drop. And somehow it works. The crowd, stunned by Tyler's death and soothed by the boy king's courage, disperses. Within days, royal forces hunt down ringleaders, executions multiply, and the revolt crumbles. The body count? Hard to pin down. Maybe a few thousand across England. Tiny compared to Mongol massacres, yet devastating in its symbolism. Villagers see their leaders hanged, their hopes dashed, and the social order restored with brutal clarity. But here's the twist. While the revolt fails in the moment, it leaves cracks in feudalism. The memory of peasants marching on London lingers in noble minds, planting seeds of reform. Historians still argue whether the revolt sped up the decline of serfdom or was just a dramatic flare, but its shadow stretches far. You wander through the smoldering aftermath, empty cottages, fields left untended, families grieving, yet you also hear whispers of pride. Old men telling children how they once marched on the Capitol, how they faced lords and kings and dared to dream of equality. The body count may be small, but the echo is mighty. As night falls, the bells fade, and you sense another tide rising, this time across the Channel. There, France and England clash for over a century, leaving countless corpses on muddy fields. The Hundred Years' War waits, and with it, some of the strangest and bloodiest battles of all. The smoke of burning manors fades, and suddenly you're standing ankle-deep in churned mud. The air reeks of sweat, horse dung, and wet wool, and above you arrows whistle like angry hornets. You've stepped into the Hundred Years' War, that sprawling clash between England and France that stretched from 1337 to 1453. It wasn't one neat war so much as a messy family feud dragged out for generations, with intermittent truces, betrayals, and resumptions. The body counts pile up in bursts, sieges, pitched battles, famines, and plagues following armies like hungry dogs. The backdrop is dynastic squabbling. English kings claim the French crown, French kings tell them to shove off, and everyone else is stuck paying taxes or bleeding on muddy fields. You wander onto one of those fields in 1346 at Crécy. The French knights, glittering in armor, thunder forward on massive war horses. It should be glorious, except the English have longbows. You hear a hiss like wind through reeds, and suddenly French cavalry crash into the mud, skewered by arrows from hundreds of yards away. Chroniclers brag that 500 knights fell that day, though historians still argue the numbers, pointing out medieval writers love to exaggerate. Quirky tidbit: the English allegedly placed their archers behind wooden stakes angled outward, like a deadly picket fence, so charging horses impaled themselves before reaching the men. Picture a DIY home security system made of sharpened logs. Effective, if a bit morbid. Fast forward to 1356 at Poitiers, where the Black Prince of England, yes, that was his nickname, probably for his dark armor, though historians still argue about the exact origin, leads his men to another shocking victory. The French king himself, John II, is captured. Imagine the humiliation. Your monarch dragged away in chains while your army's body count sprawls across hedgerows. And then, of course, comes Agincourt in 1415, the war's most famous bloodbath. You stand in sticky mud, rain still fresh from the night before. The French outnumber the English by perhaps 3-1, but the field is narrow, the ground soft. When the French knights advance, their armor bogs down, men tripping over each other, unable to maneuver. The English longbows sing again, arrows pelting like iron hail. Corpses pile in heaps, knights suffocating in the mud under the weight of their comrades. Some estimates claim 6,000 French dead, while English losses barely crack 500. Historians still argue the exact tallies, but the lopsidedness is undeniable. The quirky superstition of the day? English archers allegedly waved two fingers in a V shape at the French, mocking them by showing the digits they used to draw their bows. Some say that's the origin of the modern two-finger gesture, still considered rude in Britain today. Whether true or not, you smirk at the thought of medieval archers inventing insults that outlived their battles. But the war isn't just about arrows and knights. It's also about sieges that grind populations into dust. At Orléans in 1429, you watch as cannons roar, walls crumble, and townsfolk starve. Then enters Joan of Arc, the teenage peasant who claims divine visions. She lifts morale, leads assaults, and changes the war's momentum. Historians still argue whether her impact was tactical genius or pure inspiration, but the body counts on both sides testify to her effect. March through Normandy after Agincourt, and you see famine shadowing the armies. Soldiers loot villages, grain stores vanish, and peasants starve. Deaths here rarely make the chronicles, but for every knight slain, dozens of civilians likely perished unseen. The war's true toll may well be in the millions over its century-plus span, not just from combat but from hunger and plague. And yet quirky exchanges persist. English soldiers pick up French slang, French knights admire English longbows, mercenaries swap sides for better pay. War is destruction, but it's also weirdly social, like the world's deadliest networking event. By 1453, when the French finally push the English out of Bordeaux, the Hundred Years' War ends, not with one climactic body count, but with exhaustion. France is scarred, England broke, and the fields of Europe littered with ghosts. Historians still argue whether the war was worth it for either side, but walking through abandoned villages and toppled castles, the answer seems obvious. As you leave the sodden fields behind, you notice the sound of water lapping against stone. Ahead rises Venice, the gleaming city of canals where silk and spice wealth fuels rivalries as bloody as any battlefield. The wars of the Italian city-states are calling, and their body counts, though smaller, come with daggers, poison, and treachery as sharp as any sword. The rain-slicked fields of France fade into mist, and suddenly you're balancing on a narrow Venetian bridge, lantern light glimmering on green water below. The air smells of salt and spice, gondolas creak in the shadows, and laughter echoes from distant taverns. At first glance, it feels peaceful, but don't be fooled. Beneath the music of lutes and the shuffle of silk shoes, daggers are being sharpened. Italy's city-states, Venice, Florence, Milan, and their rivals, aren't just trading rivals. They're locked in centuries of backstabbing wars that, while smaller than Mongol massacres, rack up body counts in their own sly way. You follow the sound of clattering armor to a Florentine piazza, where mercenaries or condottieri lounge in bright plumes and polished breastplates. They're professionals, swords for hire who fight not for loyalty, but for profit. Quirky tidbit, some condottieri were so businesslike they deliberately prolong wars to keep collecting paychecks, sometimes staging mock battles where hardly anyone died. Imagine the world's deadliest subscription service, but with cancellation fees paid in blood. Still, when real clashes came, they were brutal. In 1440, at the Battle of Anghiari, Florence and Milan smash into each other in a swirling cavalry melee. Chroniclers claim 40,000 men were involved. But here's the twist. Reports say only a handful were killed, maybe 1 or 2 dozen, because so many were captured for ransom instead. Historians still argue whether Anghiari was one of history's bloodless battles, or whether chroniclers simply downplayed the gore to flatter their patrons. Either way, Leonardo da Vinci found it gripping enough to sketch his famous lost mural of cavalry chaos. But don't relax too much. Other Italian wars got nastier. At Fornovo in 1495, French invaders clashed with a league of Italian states, leaving thousands dead in a storm of pikes, crossbows, and cannon fire. You wince as the thunder of early artillery rattles your bones, stone balls smashing through ranks. Gunpowder creeping in from China via the Ottomans changes everything. Body counts begin to climb faster, each siege deadlier than the last. And speaking of sieges, step into 1494 Naples as French troops march in. Their cannons blast medieval walls to rubble in hours instead of weeks. Shocking Italians used to slow, starve them out strategies. Civilians cower as houses collapse, and for the first time you feel a shift. War moving from swordplay toward the industrial scale of the future. Historians still argue whether the Italian wars marked the birth of modern warfare, but standing here, watching stone walls crack like eggshells, you sense they're onto something. Yet the strangest killers of these city wars aren't swords or guns. They're plagues hitching rides with soldiers. In 1495, French troops retreating from Naples bring home a new, terrifying disease: syphilis. Contemporary accounts describe it as fast, disfiguring, and often fatal in its early strain. Soldiers called it the French disease, while the French naturally blamed the Italians. Quirky medieval blame game aside, its body count spread across Europe faster than any army. You might chuckle darkly at the irony. Men who survived arrows and pikes fell to a disease caught in brothels. And don't forget assassinations. Italy was the Olympic arena of creative poisonings. Powdered diamonds slipped into wine, deadly herbs baked into tarts. Urban legends swirl around families like the Borgias, notorious for turning dinner parties into death traps. Historians still argue how much of that is gossip versus fact, but the whispers alone add a chill to your evening stroll along Venetian canals. But the true devastation wasn't always counted in corpses. Wars here bled treasuries dry, wrecked trade routes, and shattered fragile alliances. Venice lost ground to the Ottomans. Florence sank into debt. Milan flipped between rulers. Behind every ledger entry was a trail of widows, orphans, and ruined artisans. The body count included not just soldiers, but economies themselves. You wander past a frescoed chapel where prayers rise for sons who never returned. Italy's wars might not rival the Mongols in raw numbers, but their mix of mercenary trickery, plague outbreaks, and poisoned goblets makes them uniquely medieval. deadly in style if not in scale. As the bells toll midnight, the canals fade into silence, and you find yourself gazing east again. Beyond the Adriatic, vast empires clash in deserts and river valleys, their death tolls reshaping continents. The Indian subcontinent waits, with wars of sultans and Mughals, whose body counts make Italian daggers look like child's play. The velvet shadows of Venice dissolve, and suddenly you're standing in the baking heat of the Indian plains. Dust rises in choking clouds, the smell of sweat and elephant dung hangs thick, and the air vibrates with the clang of steel against steel. Welcome to the subcontinent's medieval battlefields, where armies of hundreds of thousands march under fluttering banners, and the body counts are recorded not in thousands, but in tens or even hundreds of thousands. You find yourself amid the Delhi Sultanate, a Muslim dynasty that rose in the 13th century, bringing waves of conquest and rebellion. One ruler stands out like a crimson-stained thundercloud, Alauddin Khalji. In 1299, at the Battle of Kili, he throws everything against Mongol invaders. War elephants thunder forward, tusks capped with blades, trampling soldiers like ants. Chroniclers claim thousands fell in mere hours, though historians still argue whether the numbers were inflated to glorify Khalji's power. Quirky tidbit: elephants sometimes panicked, turning and crushing their own lines, a reminder that medieval tanks had minds of their own. Fast forward to the 14th century. Timur the Lame, whom you met stacking skulls back in Persia, marches into India. In 1398, he sacks Delhi, leaving it a wasteland. Reports claim 100,000 prisoners were executed before battle even began, just to avoid rebellion. Then after victory, his troops slaughter civilians until the Yamuna River itself runs red. Chroniclers may exaggerate, but the trauma etched itself deep into memory. You shiver, recalling how his campaigns stitched body counts across continents like a grim tapestry. Yet India's story isn't only about conquerors. Empires here also collided with one another. By the 16th century, the Mughal Empire rises under Babur. At Panipat in 1526, Babur faces the Delhi Sultan Ibrahim Lodi with perhaps 100,000 men. Babur has something new: gunpowder artillery. You hear the boom of cannons, the shriek of matchlocks, and watch in awe as armored war elephants scatter before fire and smoke. Chroniclers claim 20,000 to 40,000 dead in a single day. Historians still argue exact numbers, but everyone agrees it was catastrophic. The Mughals seize Delhi, and India changes forever. Quirky detail: Babur allegedly arranged carts into a kind of proto-trench system, tying them together with rawhide ropes to form barricades. Soldiers crouched behind them, firing in relative safety. Picture a medieval DIY tank wall, cobbled together with wood and leather. It worked. Lodi's forces broke against it like waves on a seawall. But not all the bloodshed came from grand battles. Rebellions and massacres scar the land too. Entire towns were sometimes cleared for refusing taxes, their body counts unrecorded, but hinted at in folk songs. And famine, often sparked by war, silently claimed millions more. Walk through the Deccan after a campaign, and you find fields abandoned, wells dry, granaries looted. The deadliest part of war was often what lingered after. You wander into a Mughal court, its marble walls gleaming, fountains gurgling, musicians playing sitar. It feels refined, but step outside and you find the scars of war never far. Historians still argue whether these empires consolidated stability or simply repeated cycles of conquest. From your vantage, surrounded by the ghosts of Panipat, the answer feels like both. And here's something odd. Amid such carnage, India also produced some of the world's most dazzling art, literature, and architecture. Even as soldiers fell by the thousands, poets wrote, painters painted, and builders raised monuments like Humayun's tomb that whispered of eternity. The juxtaposition is dizzying, beauty blooming alongside staggering death tolls. As the hot wind eases into dusk, you leave the subcontinent's plains behind. But before you close your eyes, remember, not all medieval body counts came from blades or bows. Some rose quietly from sickness, others from quakes and famines mistaken for wrathful gods. Death wore many masks, and you've walked through nearly all of them. Now your journey slows. The din of drums and cannons fades, replaced by soft crickets in the nightgrass. The body counts blur into memory, leaving only the hush of history's long breath. And here we ease into rest. You've wandered tonight through centuries of shadows, past fields where arrows fell like rain, and cities where walls toppled beneath cannons. You've counted bodies with chroniclers, weighed skull towers under Timur's cruel hand, and walked among peasants daring to march on kings. But now those voices grow faint, and the pages of history fold themselves gently shut. Listen instead to something softer. Imagine the rattle of armor fading into the rustle of leaves, the clash of steel melting into the lapping of waves against a quiet shore. Picture yourself sitting by a lantern, its glow small but steady, while beyond it stretches the endless dark. The wars and plagues of the past cannot follow you here. Only calm remains. Your breathing slows as you remember how even the bloodiest centuries gave rise to songs, to frescoes, to cathedrals that still stand. Beauty survives, always. And so do you, wrapped now in the comfort of this moment. Each story tonight was fierce, sometimes unsettling, but it was also just that, a story. The battles are long over, the warriors long gone, their dust scattered into the soil. You, on the other hand, are here, safe, listening, steady as the night drifts onward. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your mind rest on the thought that time carries all things away, even sorrow. And let sleep come, as gentle as the quiet hum of a fan in the corner, as sure as the dawn waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. History can roar, but it can also whisper. Tonight, it whispers you toward dreams.